The house at 1428 Blackwood Drive in Austin, Texas, stood as a monument to isolation disguised as luxury. It was an expansive structure of dark cedar and floor-to-ceiling glass, nestled deep within a forested cul-de-sac where the city lights struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of ancient oak trees. I had taken the job out of financial desperation, tasked with maintaining the property and caring for the owner's two massive Great Danes, Atlas and Hera. The instructions left on the kitchen counter were simple but strangely specific, demanding that all heavy deadbolts be secured before dusk and that the dogs were never to be allowed in the basement under any circumstances. The first evening settled over the property like a suffocating blanket. The oppressive Texas heat lingered outside the thick glass panes, while the heavy air conditioning system pushed a sterile coldness through the vast, empty rooms. I sat on the leather sofa in the center of the living room, watching the evening sun bleed into the horizon. The two dogs did not rest. They remained positioned at the edge of the hallway, their bodies rigid, their attention entirely focused on the shadows pooling at the far end of the corridor. Nightfall brought a profound darkness to the house. The isolation of the property meant there was no ambient light from passing cars or neighboring street lamps, only the pale glow of the security panel mounted by the front entrance. I was reading a book when the digital screen of the intercom system suddenly flared to life, casting a harsh blue light across the foyer. The visual indicator signaled motion at the front porch. A heavy knot formed in my stomach as I approached the screen, peering into the grainy black and white feed of the exterior camera. The porch was completely empty. Only the static motion of moth shadows flitting across the camera lens could be seen. Yet the motion indicator continued to flash, a relentless strobe in the dark hallway, warning of a presence the camera could not capture. I retreated to the master bedroom, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The dogs remained downstairs, a decision I would soon regret. Sleep was a fractured, elusive state, broken constantly by the sensation of being watched. The second day dragged on with an agonizing slowness. The atmosphere within the house had shifted, growing dense and heavy, as if the air itself was resisting my movements. I tried to busy myself with chores, checking the mail, watering the extensive indoor plants, but my eyes were constantly drawn to the corners of the rooms, to the spaces where the light simply refused to reach. When dusk approached, I systematically moved through the house, engaging every lock, pulling every heavy drape. As darkness took hold once again, the security system's visual alert triggered. This time, it was not the front porch. The indicator light for the rear patio doors began to pulse violently in the darkness of the kitchen. I grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker, moving with cautious, agonizingly slow steps toward the back of the house. The patio doors were massive sheets of reinforced glass, looking out into the pitch-black woods. I stood a few feet away, my reflection superimposed over the darkness outside. The light on the panel continued its frantic flashing. Then, I noticed the disruption in the condensation on the outside of the glass. In the center of the massive pane, about 7 feet off the ground, the evening dew had been wiped away, leaving a clear, distinct smear, as if something massive had pressed its face directly against the barrier, studying the interior. I backed away slowly, my grip tightening on the iron rod until my knuckles turned white. I retreated to the living room, finding Atlas and Hera huddled together near the cold fireplace. The animals were trembling, their eyes wide and unblinking, locked onto the ceiling vents above us. The third night dissolved whatever remaining logic I clung to. I had attempted to contact the homeowners, typing out urgent messages regarding the security system malfunctions and the strange occurrences, but the messages refused to send. The cellular service in the house had completely vanished, leaving the digital screen of my phone displaying a perpetual state of searching for a signal. I was entirely cut off from the outside world, sealed within the confines of 1428 Blackwood Drive. I decided to gather my belongings and leave. The money was no longer worth the crushing dread that had taken root in my chest. I packed my bag in a frantic blur, called for the dogs, and headed straight for the heavy front door. I gripped the brass handle and pulled, but the door refused to yield. The deadbolt was disengaged, yet the door felt as though it had been fused to the frame. I moved to the rear patio doors, pushing against the glass with all my weight, but it was completely unmovable. The windows, the garage entry, every single exit was sealed tight. The house had become a vault, and I was trapped inside. I returned to the kitchen, the realization of my confinement sending waves of panic through my system. It was then I saw the notepad on the central island. The paper I had used to write down my grocery list had been flipped over. A new message had been inscribed on the blank page. The handwriting was erratic, sharp, and aggressive, tearing through the paper in several places. The words offered a chilling directive, indicating that panic would only accelerate the process, and that remaining perfectly still was the only way to prolong the night. I turned my head, searching for the dogs. Atlas was standing near the basement door, his posture entirely unnatural. His head was lowered, his teeth bared, but his body was completely paralyzed. Hera was nowhere to be found. The massive animal had simply vanished from the locked house, leaving no trace, no disruption, just an agonizing absence in the heavy air. The fourth night brought the physical manifestation of the nightmare. I had barricaded myself inside the walk-in pantry, surrounded by canned goods and heavy bags of flour, holding the iron poker across my chest. The darkness in the small space was absolute. My senses were heightened to an unbearable degree. The floorboards beneath me began to vibrate, a slow, rhythmic compression of the wood that indicated immense weight moving directly above me on the second floor. The vibrations were not the quick steps of a person, but the sluggish, dragging movements of something massive hauling itself across the master bedroom floor. The vibrations ceased directly above the pantry ceiling. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy, expectant pause. Then, a fine stream of white dust began to fall from the ceiling, dusting my shoulders as the structural beams above me groaned under a localized pressure. Something was pressing its weight directly against the floorboards right above my head, waiting for me to move, waiting for me to break the stillness. I remained frozen in that position for hours, the muscles in my legs cramping and seizing, the air growing stale and thin. When the light of dawn finally crept beneath the gap in the pantry door, the oppressive weight above me seemed to lift. The house felt hollow once more. The final day was a blur of exhaustion and terror. I emerged from the pantry, moving through the house like a ghost. Atlas had disappeared during the night, just like Hera. I was completely alone in the massive structure. The day offered no comfort, only a temporary reprieve before the inevitable return of the darkness. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floors, I realized that hiding was no longer an option. The house was systematically removing every source of comfort, every companion, cornering me for the final act. I grabbed the heavy iron poker, and instead of seeking a hiding place, I walked deliberately toward the grand staircase. I ascended the stairs, the wood cold beneath my bare feet. The vibrations I had felt the previous night had left deep, unnatural gouges in the polished wood of the steps, trailing upward toward the master suite. I reached the landing. The door to the master bedroom was wide open, revealing the expansive room bathed in the dying light of the sunset. In the center of the room, near the foot of the massive four-poster bed, stood a figure that defied all anatomical logic. It was towering, its head brushing against the high vaulted ceiling. Its limbs were agonizingly thin and elongated, wrapped in garments that seemed to be woven from shadows and dust. It had its back to me, its posture hunched over something resting on the bed. I stepped into the room, my grip on the iron weapon slick with cold sweat. The figure paused its movements. The shift in the air was instantaneous, dropping the temperature in the room dramatically. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the entity turned to face me. It possessed no distinct features, no eyes to convey malice, no mouth to utter threats, just a smooth, pale surface of taut skin. In its long, multi-jointed fingers, it held a collection of worn leather collars, the brass nameplates of Atlas and Hera catching the last rays of the sun. It raised one elongated digit to where a mouth should have been, a universal gesture demanding absolute, permanent silence. The heavy oak door behind me swung shut with a violent force, sealing the room in total darkness, and the digital display of the hallway security system flashed one final time before the screen went completely black. The facility was located at 800 West Main Street in Peoria, Illinois, a windowless, brutalist concrete structure that served as the primary regional data monitoring center for a massive telecommunications conglomerate. The architecture itself seemed designed to isolate the occupants from the natural world, burying the central nervous system of the Midwest's fiber optic network deep within layers of reinforced steel and environmental control systems. The graveyard shift was an exercise in profound and absolute isolation, requiring a specific type of psychological endurance to survive the relentless hours between midnight and dawn. The environment inside the control room was maintained at a constant, uncomfortable chill to prevent the massive server arrays from overheating. The air was heavily filtered and entirely devoid of natural scents, replaced by the sterile essence of ozone and heated silicon. My workstation was positioned in the deepest sector of the subterranean floor, a solitary island of illuminated digital monitors surrounded by a vast ocean of dormant equipment. The primary directive of the job consisted of observing complex digital traffic routing, ensuring that the invisible streams of data across the state remained stable and uninterrupted during the dead hours of the night. It was intensely monotonous work, demanding absolute focus on cascading streams of diagnostic text rather than any form of human interaction. The physical reality outside those thick concrete walls simply ceased to exist for me during those hours, leaving only the steady, mesmerizing flow of digital information to anchor my perception of reality. The night in question began with an agonizing slowness. The diagnostic screens painted my face in a pale, sickly green light as the hours crawled forward. The network was operating at peak efficiency, requiring zero intervention. I was leaning back in the ergonomic mesh chair, staring blindly at the scrolling lines of regional bandwidth allocations. when the central monitoring interface registered a massive, localized anomaly. It did not trigger a standard warning visual, but rather a complete disruption of the visual interface for a specific geographic sector. The anomaly manifested at exactly 3:14 a.m. The standard cascade of green analytical data suddenly warped into a dense block of stark crimson text, indicating a catastrophic fluctuation in data packet transmission. The disruption was not a physical severance of the fiber lines, which would have simply vanished from the grid, but a bizarre, impossible surge of corrupted information originating from a single residential node. The automated routing system immediately isolated the corrupted source to prevent a network-wide contagion, projecting the subscriber's private account information across my primary display. The account was registered to an individual named Elias Thorne, with a physical address listed at 714 North Elm Street in the town of Centralia, Pennsylvania. The location itself was an immediate red flag, a town practically erased from modern maps due to a massive, unstoppable subterranean coal mine fire that had forced the government to condemn and evacuate the entire area decades ago. The fact that an active digital connection, let alone an active power grid, still existed in that toxic, desolate zone was a technical impossibility. Yet, the diagnostic interface clearly indicated an incoming emergency priority connection attempting to breach the monitoring center's firewall directly from that condemned address. I engaged the secure network receiver through my heavy headset, anticipating the usual misrouted signal or a profound technical glitch in the legacy hardware. But the physical sensation that transmitted through the earpieces was entirely unnatural. The space on the other end of the connection was completely devoid of standard electronic interference. It was replaced by a heavy, oppressive atmospheric pressure that seemed to push physically against my eardrums. It possessed a dense, almost liquid quality that felt completely alien to a digital network. The telemetry data on my secondary screen began to behave erratically, mapping out the environmental conditions of the Centralia address through the router's integrated diagnostic sensors. The readings were impossible. The sensors indicated a rapid, devastating drop in the ambient temperature within the residence, plummeting well below freezing in a matter of seconds, accompanied by a complete failure of the local electrical grid. Yet, the router itself continued to transmit a flawless signal, seemingly operating on an unknown, independent power source that defied all logical explanation. The nature of the incoming data shifted drastically, abandoning standard network protocols and transferring a raw, visceral wave of pure terror directly through the fiber optics. The entity on the other end of the connection, the presence identified by the system as Elias Thorne, was desperately attempting to relay a catastrophic environmental collapse without utilizing any standard communication methods. The advanced diagnostic tools on my terminal began translating the frantic, corrupted data packets into a horrifying visual narrative. The physical structure of the house at 714 North Elm Street was being systematically compromised, not by an organic intruder or physical force, but by a sudden and absolute absence of physical matter. The external environmental sensors registered absolute zero readings at the perimeter of the property line, indicating that the physical space surrounding the house had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a perfect, consuming void. The digital readout painted a terrifying picture of a presence isolated within a rapidly shrinking sphere of reality, forced to bear witness as the exterior walls of the home were slowly devoured by a fundamental emptiness. The distress signal carried an agonizing emotional weight, a profound plea for intervention that no network administrator could ever possibly provide. I attempted to initiate a remote diagnostic reset, aggressively sending a massive surge of corrective data to force the router to reboot, desperately hoping to clear the terrifying telemetry readings and reset the connection. But my commands were entirely swallowed by the corrupted link, disappearing into the digital void without a single trace of acknowledgement. The atmospheric pressure conveyed through the headset grew immensely heavy, mimicking the crushing physical sensation of descending far too deep underwater without oxygen. The diagnostic screen showed the temperature anomaly breaching the exterior walls of the Centralia residence, moving with a deliberate, calculating slowness toward the central living room where the router was physically located. The emotional weight transmitted through the line intensified, shifting from frantic, chaotic panic to a profound, paralyzing state of absolute despair. The entity known as Elias was no longer attempting to halt the progression of the anomaly. The data stream conveyed a final, chilling realization, indicating an awareness that the darkness invading the home was not a mere absence of light, but a conscious, malevolent force that possessed a distinct and terrible hunger. The telemetry mapped the void spreading across the floorboards, erasing the physical structure of the room inch by agonizing inch. The digital connection did not sever cleanly when the end finally came. Instead, the available bandwidth slowly constricted, as if the physical infrastructure of the network cables was being crushed under an unimaginable, localized gravity. The telemetry data on my screen began to permanently deactivate, sensor by sensor, room by room, until only the central node remained active in a sea of red warnings. The final packet of information transmitted before the total network collapse contained no diagnostic data whatsoever. It delivered an overwhelming, suffocating sensation of absolute cold and infinite, eternal isolation directly into my consciousness. The connection then terminated entirely, leaving an expansive void in the headset that felt infinitely more terrifying than the previous atmospheric disturbance. The digital displays across my workstation immediately returned to their standard green cascade, effortlessly wiping away the chaotic and terrifying readings of the past 20 minutes as if they had never existed. The automated tracking system logged the catastrophic interaction simply as a routine dropped connection due to localized weather interference, assigning it a mundane error code that entirely belied the absolute horror of the event. The remainder of the shift was a grueling, torturous exercise in maintaining basic psychological stability. The sterile fluorescent lights of the monitoring center suddenly felt harsh and predatory, casting sharp, unnatural shadows across the concrete floor that seemed to stretch just a fraction too far. I remained perfectly still in my ergonomic chair, my eyes locked onto the rolling green data, refusing to look toward the dark corners of the subterranean facility. When the morning staff finally arrived to relieve me at 6 o'clock, I did not immediately exit the building into the safety of the daylight. I bypassed the locker room and accessed the archive server data from an isolated, secure terminal in the administrative wing. I meticulously pulled the encrypted digital logs from the 3:14 a.m. interaction, isolating the primary audio file, the specific recording that should have contained the exact environmental conditions of Elias Thorne's residence and my own diagnostic responses to the crisis. I engaged the playback mechanism, bracing myself for the oppressive, liquid pressure that had plagued the live connection, expecting the terrifying reality of the void to spill out into the administrative office. The recording contained absolutely nothing of the sort. The audio file was a perfect, pristine documentation of my own side of the interaction, my attempts to stabilize the connection, my technical directives, my slowly escalating state of panic, all captured in crystal clear high definition. but the space between my transmissions, the agonizing minutes where the terrifying data from Centralia had overwhelmed the line and pressed against my eardrums, were entirely empty. There was no atmospheric pressure, no unnatural coldness, no entity desperately pleading for salvation through corrupted data packets. Just a flat, perfect silence that stretched on for agonizing minutes. The advanced telecommunications system had meticulously recorded a one-sided conversation with an absolute phantom. I left the facility shortly after, stepping out into the bright, glaring morning sun of Peoria. But the intense heat of the summer day offered absolutely no warmth against the profound, agonizing chill that had settled deep within my bones. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of automatic physical responses, my mind entirely consumed by the implications of the empty recording. Upon returning to my residence, I completely ignored the exhaustion tearing at my muscles and immediately accessed a secure external historical database. I initiated a comprehensive search of public records, focusing specifically on the name Elias Thorne and the exact residential address in Centralia, Pennsylvania. The search results populated the screen with a terrifying, undeniable finality. The residence at 714 North Elm Street had been completely destroyed in a sudden, catastrophic sinkhole collapse directly related to the uncontrolled underground mine fires. The structural failure had swallowed the entire property in a matter of minutes, leaving behind nothing but a smoldering crater. The event had occurred exactly 12 years prior to the exact minute of my shift. The official government reports detailed the total, unrecoverable loss of the property and its sole occupant, Elias Thorne, whose remains were never retrieved from the burning, toxic depths of the earth. The digital monitoring system had not connected to a living customer, struggling with a local outage. It had somehow intercepted a residual distress signal permanently trapped within the decaying infrastructure, a digital echo of a 12-year-old nightmare looping endlessly through the buried fiber optic lines, waiting in the dark for someone to finally witness the end. The asphalt of Highway 19E eventually surrendered to broken gravel and then to absolutely nothing at all. Arthur Pendleton did not cast a final glance backward as the last physical traces of Carter County disappeared behind the dense, suffocating tree line of the Cherokee National Forest. He carried the entirety of his existence strapped to his back, an olive-drab canvas pack heavily burdened with the absolute, uncompromising necessities of survival. He was not seeking a temporary reprieve from the complexities of the modern world. He was executing a permanent separation, a complete and total immersion into the ancient, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. His journey commenced at the very edge of the established trails near the Laurel Fork Gorge, where the worn dirt path offered a false, dangerous illusion of security. Arthur possessed no intention of following the designated markers. He veered violently away from the cleared routes, plunging directly into the untamed, unmapped sectors of the deep forest. The initial days were an agonizing blur of intense, relentless physical exertion. The mountainsides in this specific region were aggressively steep, covered entirely in a thick, treacherous layer of decomposing leaves and loose, shifting shale. Every single forward movement required a conscious calculation, a continuous, exhausting physical negotiation with gravity and the unforgiving terrain. The overwhelming scale of the Cherokee National Forest immediately began to dismantle his perception of time and consequence. The sheer density of the towering oaks and massive hemlocks created a perpetual, localized twilight upon the forest floor, blocking out the direct passage of the sun. Arthur moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, preserving his fading energy reserves, his muscles constantly burning under the continuous strain of the heavy equipment. He established his base camps in total concealment, stringing up a dark, matte green tarp that blended seamlessly into the surrounding, suffocating foliage. The absolute removal from human contact began to fundamentally alter his cognitive processes. The continuous stream of trivial, manufactured information that normally occupied the modern human mind simply evaporated, leaving behind a vast, expansive emptiness. Arthur found his thoughts slowing down, becoming heavy and singular in their purpose. He became entirely obsessed with the fundamental mechanics of his own biology, the measured rhythm of his breathing, the steady, demanding pulse of his own heart pushing blood through his exhausted veins. He spent entire afternoons watching the meticulous, organized labor of a colony of ants systematically dismantling the remains of a fallen wasp, finding a strange, hypnotic perfection in the absolute ruthlessness of the natural world. The forest was entirely devoid of malice, but it was equally devoid of mercy or compassion. It was a system of continuous, unapologetic consumption, and Arthur was acutely aware that his presence within this system was a severe intrusion. By the 10th day of his isolation, his navigation had carried him across a geographical depression that was entirely omitted from any standard topographical maps. The sunlight completely failed to penetrate the dense, overlapping canopy of this specific valley, casting the entire area in a perpetual, bruised gray light. The atmosphere within this depression was perfectly stagnant, entirely lacking the refreshing, cool thermal currents that regularly swept across the higher mountain ridges. It possessed a dense, gelatinous physical quality, carrying the cloying, heavy scent of wet ash and severely crushed fungi. The most alarming aspect of this deep valley was the total absence of standard biological activity. The natural wildlife, the squirrels, the varied avian species, the relentless insects, were entirely missing. The valley was a geographical dead zone, a place where the vibrant, chaotic energy of the surrounding forest had been deliberately and systematically drained away. Arthur established his shelter beneath the massive, exposed root system of a violently overturned hemlock tree. The deep hollow beneath the tangled roots offered a natural, fortified concealment, a deeply necessary physical defense against the oppressive, unnatural atmosphere of the dead valley. It was during the long, stretching hours of the late afternoon that he first observed the catastrophic discrepancy in his environment. The forest, which was normally a complex network of subtle physical movements and shifting light, had become entirely static. The leaves hanging from the branches did not sway or tremble. The high, pale grass remained perfectly rigid. The entire ecosystem had fallen into a state of absolute, paralyzing immobility. It was a collective physical reaction to the arrival of an apex presence, a localized shutdown of all natural processes. He remained perfectly still within the dark confines of his shelter, his wide eyes frantically scanning the dense line of dead, skeletal trees. He did not rely on any auditory information, for the air remained completely stripped of any vibration or disturbance. He relied entirely on his visual perception and the primal, instinctive warnings radiating forcefully from his own nervous system. The temperature within the hollow dropped significantly and rapidly, pulling a cold, heavy sweat from his pores. The shadows cast by the dead trunks began to lengthen artificially, stretching across the forest floor in unnatural, geometric directions that directly defied the actual position of the hidden sun. The visual anomaly manifested slowly, forming at the extreme edge of his peripheral vision. A large section of the dense underbrush, approximately 50 yards from his concealed position, appeared to shift, not swaying with the breeze, but physically displacing its own mass. Arthur aggressively controlled the intake of his breath, pressing his spine firmly against the cold, damp earth of the hollow. The shape that slowly emerged from the thicket completely defied standard biological classification. It was bipedal, towering well over 7 feet in actual height, its physical form seemingly composed entirely of the very decaying matter that choked the valley floor. Its exterior was a chaotic, shifting mass of dark, wet bark, rotting vegetation, and long, incredibly pale limbs that perfectly mirrored the skeletal, broken branches of the dead hemlock trees. Its progression through the forest was a terrifying masterclass in predatory stealth. The entity did not disturb the physical environment. It seemed to pass directly through the obstacles, a localized distortion of physical reality moving with an agonizingly slow, calculating, and absolute purpose. Arthur realized with a sudden, crushing clarity that this creature was not aimlessly foraging through the woods. It was actively, deliberately hunting, and it was systematically sweeping the entire valley floor for his specific biological signature. The entity paused its forward movement, slowly turning its upper mass directly toward Arthur's concealed position. It lacked any defined facial features, possessing only a smooth, flat expanse of pale, wood-like tissue where a face should have logically existed. Yet, the physical sensation of being intensely observed, of being clinically evaluated and categorized as immediate prey, was completely overwhelming. The entity's camouflage was a terrifying display of instantaneous biological adaptation. When it ceased its forward progression, it became completely indistinguishable from the surrounding dead timber. Its long, pale arms hung completely motionless by its sides, perfectly mirroring the drooping, broken branches of the dying trees. Arthur observed the horrifying way the creature interacted with the ambient light. Its physical surface did not reflect the gray twilight. It seemed to actively absorb the illumination, casting a shadow that was far too dense and heavy for its actual physical form. It was as if the creature was a localized singularity, slowly pulling the surrounding reality into its dark, decaying mass. The night that immediately followed was a grueling, torturous exercise in pure psychological endurance. The darkness within the deep valley was absolute and impenetrable, completely stripping Arthur of his primary sense of sight. He remained curled tightly within the cramped hollow of the overturned roots, his trembling hands gripping the cold, heavy steel of his survival knife. The ambient temperature continued to plummet relentlessly, freezing the heavy condensation directly onto his tarp. He could not visually track the entity, but he could feel its immense, oppressive physical presence pressing heavily down upon the entire campsite. The air grew incredibly dense and thick, making it physically difficult to pull sufficient oxygen into his burning lungs. Throughout the long, agonizingly slow hours of the endless night, the physical structure of his temporary shelter was severely tested. The massive, ancient roots directly above his head began to slowly compress downward, shifting violently under an immense, localized weight. The loose dirt and small stones rained down upon his shoulders in a slow, steady stream of debris. The entity was actively positioning its massive form directly above his concealment, using its sheer physical mass to press down upon the fragile earth. Arthur did not move a single muscle. He did not attempt to strike upward with his blade. He knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that engaging the creature in any form of physical combat would result in immediate, violent termination. He forced his entire body to remain entirely limp, mimicking the lifeless, rotting decay of the valley itself. He deliberately slowed his heart rate through intense concentration, brutally suppressing the violent tremors of pure terror that threatened to shake his exhausted limbs. The crushing, suffocating weight remained directly above him for hours, a silent, terrifying, physical standoff between a desperate man and an ancient, unrecognizable horror of the deep woods. The entity was deliberately testing his psychological resolve, waiting patiently for a single sudden movement, a single display of panic that would confirm his exact physical location. Arthur maintained his death-like stillness, forcefully separating his consciousness from the agonizing cramps tearing through his muscles and the suffocating lack of breathable oxygen. He became a stone, a piece of dead wood, an empty shell completely devoid of life or heat. When the first pale, weak light of the morning dawn finally began to pierce the dense canopy, the suffocating physical pressure directly above him slowly began to recede. The withdrawal of the creature was not marked by any sudden departure, but by a gradual, creeping lightening of the atmospheric pressure. The oppressive, unnatural cold slowly lifted from the hollow, replaced by the standard, biting chill of a normal Tennessee morning. Arthur remained frozen in his defensive position for an additional 3 hours, his eyes locked intensely onto the small gap in the roots, desperately waiting for the natural, chaotic movement of the forest to return. When he finally observed a single, small spider moving slowly across the dirt inches from his face, he knew the immediate, localized threat had finally passed. The extraction from the dead valley was a frantic, desperate push against the absolute limits of his own physical endurance. Arthur abandoned the vast majority of his heavy gear, taking only his compass, his knife, and his remaining purified water. He moved with a reckless, dangerous speed, pushing violently through the dense laurel thickets and scrambling frantically up the steep, muddy embankments. He did not stop to rest his burning muscles. He did not cast a single look over his shoulder into the gray depths. He focused entirely on the magnetic north indicated by his compass, driving himself relentlessly toward the distant, expansive waters of Watauga Lake. The brutal journey took 2 entire days of continuous, agonizing forward movement. His clothing was severely torn, his skin heavily scratched and continuously bleeding from the aggressive, unforgiving vegetation. By the time he finally breached the final tree line and saw the gray, rippling surface of the massive lake, he was operating entirely on pure, exhausted adrenaline. He collapsed heavily onto the rocky shoreline, the freezing cold water washing over his heavy boots. The vast, open space of the lake felt like a profound, necessary sanctuary after the suffocating confinement of the deep woods. Arthur Pendleton did not return to normal society. Not fully. The terrifying experience in the unmapped depths of the Unaka Mountains had permanently fractured his perception of physical reality. He found that he could no longer tolerate the enclosed, restrictive spaces of modern architecture, nor could he ever again step beneath the shadow of a dense forest canopy. He became a permanent fixture on the absolute outer fringes of the lakeside communities in Carter County, a transient ghost haunting the wide open spaces where the horizon remained clearly visible at all times. He eventually constructed a small makeshift shelter on an exposed rocky peninsula situated as far away from the heavy tree line as physically possible. He spends his days sitting perfectly still, watching the deep green wall of the Cherokee National Forest looming across the water, his eyes constantly scanning the shifting shadows between the trees, acutely aware that the ancient, towering presence is still out there, waiting patiently in the breathless stillness of the dead valley. The massive digital infrastructure of the modern world requires substantial physical anchors, enormous, windowless concrete fortresses strategically positioned within major global financial hubs. The commercial data center, located on Hanauer Landstrasse in Frankfurt, Germany, stands as one of the most vital internet exchange points on the European continent. It is a sterile, heavily fortified monument to global connectivity, processing billions of mundane digital interactions every single fraction of a second. The exterior presents a facade of absolute corporate legitimacy, yet, buried deep within the heavily encrypted, climate-controlled server racks of this specific facility, existed a localized digital empire constructed entirely upon the foundation of profound, unimaginable human suffering. The network was known within the deepest, most inaccessible layers of the Tor browser simply as the Obsidian Registry. It did not function as a standard dark web marketplace, nor was it a simple repository for illicit contraband. It was a highly exclusive, meticulously organized digital theater, a closed ecosystem designed for the interactive observation and systematic destruction of human subjects. The platform operated under a strict, uncompromising invitation-only protocol, requiring prospective members to provide extensive, horrifying proof of their absolute moral bankruptcy before access was granted. Once admitted into the registry, the members were introduced to a sophisticated, heavily categorized user interface that mirrored the polished efficiency of mainstream streaming services. The content, however, consisted entirely of live, uninterrupted video feeds, transmitting from hidden locations across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. The subjects featured within these feeds were entirely stripped of their autonomy, trapped in sterile, sealed environments, and subjected to an endless, escalating series of physical and psychological torments directed entirely by the anonymous viewers. The users of the Obsidian Registry did not merely observe the suffering, they orchestrated it. The platform featured a complex financial bidding system, utilizing highly anonymized cryptocurrency transactions, allowing the highest bidders to directly dictate the specific nature of the cruelty inflicted upon the subjects. It was a system that completely commodified human agony, transforming profound trauma into a casual, interactive form of digital entertainment for an elite, untraceable demographic. For over 3 years, the Obsidian Registry operated with absolute impunity. It amassed a dedicated, highly organized user base of over 70,000 active participants, individuals who seamlessly blended into standard society during the daylight hours, only to retreat into the shadows of the encrypted network to indulge their most depraved psychological urges. The platform was a malignant cancer, growing undetected beneath the surface of the internet, expanding its horrific archives with every passing day. The sheer volume of the visual data generated by the network was staggering. Tens of thousands of hours of high-definition video, meticulously categorized by the specific nature of the trauma inflicted, were permanently stored within the heavily fortified Frankfurt servers. The administrators of the site had established a rigid, almost clinical set of operational guidelines, instructing their users on the precise methods required to maintain absolute digital anonymity. They enforced mandatory use of complex virtual private networks, heavily encrypted communication channels, and decentralized routing protocols, ensuring that the true identities of the participants remained permanently obscured behind layers of impenetrable code. The ultimate downfall of the Obsidian Registry did not stem from a failure of its advanced cryptographic defenses, but rather from a minuscule, almost imperceptible flaw in physical logistics. A specialized task force within the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Federal Intelligence Service, in coordination with the Central Europol Cybercrime Division, had spent 18 months blindly analyzing massive swaths of regional internet traffic. They eventually detected a microscopic, recurring anomaly in the power consumption data surrounding the Hanauer Landstrasse facility, directly correlating with massive, localized spikes in encrypted Tor traffic. The subsequent investigation was an exercise in extreme, agonizing patience. The intelligence operatives deployed advanced packet-sniffing algorithms, slowly, methodically tracing the complex digital breadcrumbs back to a series of heavily fortified entry nodes. The operation culminated in a highly synchronized, multinational physical raid executed across several major European cities. Teams of specialized federal agents simultaneously breached luxury residences in Munich, Vienna, and a heavily secured estate situated on the outskirts of Brussels. 4 primary targets were successfully apprehended during the coordinated strikes. These individuals were the core architects, the supreme administrators who had conceptualized and maintained the horrific digital infrastructure of the registry. They were immediately stripped of their electronic devices, their physical assets frozen, and their bodies transferred to heavily guarded federal holding facilities to await prosecution. The global media anticipated a massive, highly publicized trial, a profound public reckoning for the architects of one of the most insidious networks ever discovered. The reality of the judicial proceedings, however, proved to be a profound, infuriating betrayal of public trust. When the trial finally commenced at the Federal Court of Justice in Karlsruhe, the massive, heavy wooden doors of the courtroom were abruptly and permanently sealed. The press was entirely barred from the premises. The general public was completely excluded from the proceedings. The federal prosecutors invoked a series of obscure, highly classified national security provisions, effectively plunging the entire legal process into absolute secrecy. The official justification provided to the media claimed that the exclusion was entirely necessary to protect the identities of the victims and prevent the dissemination of the horrific methods utilized by the network. While the protection of the victims offered a plausible, convenient excuse, the actual details that eventually leaked from the closed sessions painted a far more sinister, terrifying picture of systemic corruption. The interrogations of the captured administrators revealed a catastrophic breach of government integrity. The most sophisticated, impenetrable layers of the Obsidian Registry's digital defenses, the complex routing scripts that had successfully baffled international intelligence agencies for years, had not been authored by a rogue criminal element. The platform's ultimate security architect, the individual responsible for building the impenetrable vault that housed the horrors, was identified as a senior, highly decorated director within a major European cybersecurity agency. This government official had actively utilized his vast institutional knowledge, his high-level security clearances, and the advanced technological resources provided by the state to construct and protect the most depraved criminal enterprise on the dark web. His role involved the continuous monitoring of federal investigative protocols, allowing him to actively sabotage ongoing operations and provide the registry with advanced, real-time warnings regarding potential law enforcement actions. The completely inaccessible trial in Karlsruhe was not an effort to protect the innocent. It was a desperate, highly orchestrated maneuver by the state to suppress a catastrophic political scandal. The government chose to completely bury the profound betrayal committed by one of their own highest-ranking security officials, prioritizing the preservation of institutional reputation over transparent, absolute justice. The 4 administrators were eventually handed their verdicts in complete secrecy, receiving incredibly lenient, drastically reduced prison sentences that entirely failed to reflect the monumental scale and absolute severity of their crimes. They were given terms ranging from a mere 6 to 11 years, a negligible punishment for individuals responsible for the orchestration of thousands of hours of documented, horrific human suffering. The leniency of the sentences was a profound, devastating insult to the fundamental concept of justice, but the absolute horror of the Obsidian Registry did not end with the conclusion of the secret trial. The massive, localized servers within the Hanauer Landstrasse facility had been physically seized by the federal authorities, effectively terminating the active operation of the platform. The government agencies involved in the raid, however, exhibited a profound, negligent lack of urgency regarding the actual destruction of the stored data. They were entirely focused on the prosecution of the primary targets and the aggressive containment of the subsequent political fallout, completely ignoring the massive cache of horrific visual evidence still residing on the seized hardware. Less than 48 hours after the official shutdown of the network, a massive, decentralized data dump appeared on several secondary dark web forums. An unknown entity, potentially a peripheral member of the original administrative circle who had evaded capture, had successfully executed a comprehensive backup of the entire Obsidian Registry database prior to the federal raids. The entire catalog of human suffering, the thousands of hours of terrifying, interactive trauma, was suddenly available for unrestricted download by anyone possessing the requisite technical knowledge to locate the hidden links. The network had proven itself to be a terrifying, resilient hydra. The physical servers in Frankfurt had been confiscated, but the digital essence of the registry, the profound, permanent documentation of the cruelty, had simply fractured and multiplied across the deepest layers of the internet. The government authorities offered no official response to the massive data leak, displaying a complete, infuriating apathy toward the continued exploitation of the documented subjects. The ultimate eradication of the leaked data did not originate from any official law enforcement agency or government entity. The intervention was executed by a small, highly dedicated collective of independent investigative journalists and rogue technical specialists operating under the designation of the Null Protocol. This group possessed a deep, fundamental understanding of dark web infrastructure and a profound moral obligation to remove the offending material from circulation. The collective initiated a massive, highly coordinated cyber operation, infiltrating the numerous decentralized file hosting platforms where the registry data had been mirrored. They utilized custom-built, aggressive digital scraping tools to locate every single fragmented packet of the horrific archives. The operation required weeks of continuous, exhausting technical labor, constantly navigating complex, heavily fortified dark web environments to isolate the malicious files. The Null Protocol systematically engaged and destroyed over 20 terabytes of highly encrypted data, executing a comprehensive, permanent digital incineration of the leaked archives. They did not merely delete the superficial links, they aggressively overwrote the physical sectors of the hosting servers with complex cryptographic junk data, ensuring that the original files could never be recovered or reconstructed by any advanced forensic methods. The sheer volume of the data eradicated by the independent collective was absolutely staggering, representing decades of continuous, high-definition visual trauma permanently wiped from existence. Their actions, driven entirely by a profound sense of moral duty, accomplished what the combined forces of international law enforcement and intelligence agencies had completely failed, or deliberately refused, to achieve. The complete destruction of the data offered a small, crucial victory against the sprawling darkness of the hidden internet. But the overarching reality of the situation remains deeply, profoundly unsettling. The Obsidian Registry is permanently offline, its vast archives reduced to corrupted, unreadable code. But the terrifying circumstances surrounding its creation and eventual suppression continue to cast a long, heavy shadow. The fact that such a massive, organized network of pure cruelty could operate undetected for years is disturbing enough, but the realization that it was actively facilitated and protected by the very individuals tasked with safeguarding digital security is a chilling, absolute betrayal. The sealed doors of the Karlsruhe courthouse stand as a permanent, physical monument to systemic corruption, a stark reminder that the deepest, most terrifying horrors of the dark web are not always authored by anonymous criminals in distant, lawless nations. Sometimes, the most profound darkness is cultivated and protected by those residing in the highest, most secure echelons of modern society. Utilizing the massive, legitimate infrastructure of places like the Hanauer Landstrasse facility to harbor nightmares right beneath the surface of the mundane world. And as long as the mechanisms of power remain shrouded in absolute secrecy, the potential for another registry to emerge in the hidden depths of the network remains a constant, terrifying possibility. The heavily fortified perimeter of Fort Meade in Maryland concealed a repository far more dangerous than any conventional physical armory ever constructed. The National Security Agency maintained a highly classified digital vault, a secure environment containing the most sophisticated cyber warfare tools ever engineered by human intelligence. These were not mere surveillance programs. They were complex weapons, written with the sole purpose of dismantling the foundational architecture of global networks. Among these deeply hidden assets existed a specific exploit designated as Eternal Blue, paired directly with a persistent backdoor mechanism known as Double Pulsar. These tools represented the digital equivalent of an invisible, unstoppable force, completely capable of bypassing the core security protocols of millions of operating systems worldwide without leaving a single trace of infiltration. The architects of these weapons operated under the absolute belief that the code was perfectly contained, secured behind impenetrable layers of federal cryptography. The illusion of absolute control was completely shattered in the early months of the year. A highly sophisticated and entirely anonymous entity, operating under the designation of the Shadow Brokers, executed a catastrophic breach. They did not merely steal the highly classified weapons. They methodically exposed them to the darkest, most unregulated corners of the internet. The source code for Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar was abruptly released into the public domain, transforming a heavily guarded military asset into an easily accessible tool for any malicious actor possessing a basic internet connection. The global intelligence community observed the massive leak with a profound, paralyzing dread, fully comprehending the apocalyptic potential of their own creation now circulating freely among international cyber syndicates. The raw military code was rapidly intercepted by an incredibly disciplined, highly organized collective of digital mercenaries, operating from heavily concealed server farms deep within Asia. This group possessed a specific, uncompromising agenda that prioritized mass disruption and global financial extortion above all else. They systematically extracted the flawless infiltration mechanism of Eternal Blue, combined it with the silent persistence of Double Pulsar, and attached a devastating payload of their own design. The payload was a highly aggressive ransomware program designed to violently encrypt every single byte of data it encountered. They named this horrific amalgamation WannaCry. It was a perfect, self-propagating digital contagion, requiring absolutely zero human interaction to spread exponentially from one machine to another across connected networks. The global infrastructure remained completely oblivious as the first localized infections initiated on the morning of May 12th. The virus moved seamlessly through the underwater fiber optic cables with the terrifying speed of light, actively seeking out legacy systems and unpatched vulnerabilities. The United Kingdom experienced the initial, devastating wave of the digital assault. The National Health Service, a massive organization responsible for the critical medical care of millions of citizens, found its entire digital infrastructure suddenly and violently compromised. Medical professionals in London, Manchester, and across the entire country stared at their monitors in absolute horror. The standard patient interfaces were completely erased, replaced instantly by a stark, blood-red window displaying a terrifying ultimatum. The impact on the medical facilities was immediate and entirely catastrophic. Life-saving equipment reliant on networked data suddenly ceased to function. Decades of meticulous patient records, critical surgical schedules, and delicate dosage algorithms were instantly locked behind impenetrable, military-grade encryption. Hospital administrators were forced to entirely abandon their modern infrastructure, reverting to physical paper and pen while active medical emergencies unfolded rapidly around them. Ambulances carrying critical trauma patients had to be diverted to distant facilities, plunging the entire regional healthcare system into a state of severe, agonizing paralysis. The red screens demanding payment in untraceable cryptocurrency multiplied across thousands of clinical terminals, a synchronized display of pure digital extortion. The contagion did not confine itself to the physical borders of the United Kingdom. The self-propagating nature of WannaCry allowed it to traverse international boundaries without encountering the slightest resistance. In Germany, the central nervous system of the national railway infrastructure was completely overwhelmed by the advancing code. The massive digital boards displaying departure schedules in Frankfurt and Berlin abruptly shifted to the menacing red ransom note. Millions of commuters were stranded as the logistical coordination of the transportation network completely evaporated into the digital void. The infection spread to the massive automotive manufacturing plants in France, forcing expansive assembly lines to immediately halt their operations. The relentless expansion of the virus demonstrated the severe, terrifying fragility of global interconnectedness. Major telecommunication conglomerates in Spain found their internal networks completely disabled, preventing their technical staff from coordinating any form of localized defense. Massive logistics companies operating international shipping fleets lost all capacity to track their cargo, causing billions of dollars in international trade to freeze entirely in place. Russian banking institutions and government ministries experienced severe internal disruptions, their legacy operating systems completely defenseless against the stolen federal exploit. The virus was entirely indiscriminate, infecting personal laptops, massive corporate servers, and critical government infrastructure with the exact same ruthless efficiency. Within a mere 48 hours, the infection had successfully penetrated the digital borders of over 150 countries. More than 200,000 individual computer systems were held entirely hostage by the relentless code. The global economy teetered precariously on the edge of a precipitous, unprecedented collapse. Cybersecurity experts across the world worked in a state of continuous, exhausting panic, attempting desperately to isolate networks and reverse engineer the incredibly complex encryption. But the virus always remained several steps ahead, multiplying faster than any human organization could possibly track or contain. The visual aesthetic of the red ransom screen became a universal symbol of modern vulnerability, a constant, glaring reminder that the digital foundation of society was actively crumbling. The ultimate salvation of the global network did not originate from a massive federal agency or a heavily funded corporate cybersecurity firm. It came from a small, unassuming bedroom in the coastal town of Ilfracombe in Devon, England. A 22-year-old independent malware analyst named Marcus Hutchins watched the global catastrophe unfold from his personal workstation. He operated under an anonymous pseudonym, spending his days meticulously dissecting malicious code in isolated virtual environments, the digital equivalent of studying deadly pathogens in a highly secure laboratory. Marcus managed to acquire a live sample of the incredibly dangerous WannaCry executable. He carefully introduced the highly contagious code into a heavily restricted sandbox environment, a simulated network designed to observe the exact behavior of the virus without allowing it to infect his actual hardware or escape onto the wider internet. He meticulously analyzed the complex sequence of actions the virus executed upon initial infection, slowly stripping away the dense layers of obfuscation to reveal the core mechanics of the ransomware. His eyes scanned thousands of lines of hostile code, searching for a single flaw, a structural weakness in the seemingly perfect weapon. Amidst the chaotic propagation routines and the aggressive encryption commands, Marcus isolated a highly unusual, seemingly illogical network request, buried deep within the architecture of the virus. Before the code initiated the encryption process on a newly infected machine, it automatically attempted to establish a connection with a very specific, incredibly long, and seemingly random web domain. It was a string of nonsensical characters ending in a standard commercial extension. Marcus utilized specialized diagnostic tools to query the status of this specific web address. The results revealed that the domain was completely unregistered. It did not exist anywhere on the internet. The inclusion of the unregistered domain was a deliberate, highly calculated structural mechanism built directly into the virus by its creators. It was an advanced evasion technique, a method for the virus to detect if it was being analyzed within a controlled laboratory environment by security professionals. If the virus successfully connected to the domain, it assumed it was being monitored and immediately initiated a self-termination sequence to avoid deep analysis. Because the domain was unregistered in the real world, the virus always failed to connect in the wild, and therefore continued its relentless global expansion. Marcus realized the profound, world-altering implications of this specific line of code. He did not consult with international authorities or seek permission from global intelligence agencies. He navigated to a standard, publicly available domain registration service. He meticulously entered the exact string of random characters utilized by the WannaCry virus and paid a standard fee of less than $11 to officially claim ownership of the web address. He then immediately configured the newly registered domain to point to a benign, active server, creating a live destination for the virus to finally find. The effect on the global crisis was instantaneous and completely miraculous. As the virus continued its relentless attempt to infect new machines across the globe, the code executed its standard preliminary check. But this time, the domain was active. The connection was successfully established. The virus, interpreting the successful connection as a definitive sign that it was being analyzed, immediately aborted its infection protocol. The self-propagating digital contagion, which had successfully paralyzed the infrastructure of the modern world, simply ceased all forward momentum. The rapid, uncontrollable spread of WannaCry was entirely halted by a single, inexpensive web registration. The discovery of the kill switch did not decrypt the hundreds of thousands of computers already held hostage by the red screens. The victims who had already fallen prey to the encryption were still faced with the catastrophic loss of their data, but the exponential growth of the infection was permanently broken. The global cybersecurity community utilized the massive reprieve to rapidly deploy the necessary patches and secure the remaining vulnerable systems. The total financial damage inflicted by the virus was estimated to be well over $4 billion. A staggering testament to the immense destructive potential of weaponized code. The incident served as a profound, terrifying demonstration of the fragility of the digital age. The absolute devastation was entirely the result of tools engineered by a government agency meant to protect national security, stolen and successfully repurposed by malicious actors. The event permanently altered the global perspective on cyber warfare, proving that the most dangerous weapons in the modern arsenal do not utilize explosives or kinetic force. They are composed entirely of logic and syntax, silently waiting in the dark corners of the network for the perfect opportunity to dismantle the world. And the terrifying reality remains that the defense against such absolute destruction relies not on massive armies, but on the fragile hope that someone, somewhere, will find the hidden flaw in the code before the darkness consumes everything.